Our guests today are Tom Kim and Kyoko Takahashi Lin. Tom is a partner of Gibson Dunn here in Washington, D.C. He used to be chief counsel for the SEC's Division of Corporation Finance. Kyoko is a partner of Davis Polk up in New York. She's been doing this proxy season conference thing with me forever. We're going to talk about perks, particularly the SEC's recent enforcement investigations. I'm Brock Romanak today on Zippy Point. Perk investigations by the SEC. There's been about a dozen cases over the years, over the last 20 years, I should say, since General Electric's case back in the mid-90s before Tom worked at GE. But now there's been some new cases, and so I thought it was a good time to catch up with Tom and Kyoko and find out some of the particulars about that, about Perk's disclosure generally. So Tom, I know you worked on one of these recent Perk cases. How are these Perk cases different from the dozen other cases that the SEC has brought over the recent past?
Thanks, Brock. Yes, the Commission brought two Perks cases this year. The first one is June against Argo Group International, which I worked on. And then another was brought in September against Hilton. And these two cases follow on the case against Dow Chemical brought in July of 2018. I think what's interesting is that all three cases are similar in that they all appear to have misapplied the definition of perquisite. This is expressly indicated in the orders against Dow Chemical and Hilton, not so in the SEC order against Argo, but Argo also involved the misapplication of that definition. And so I think a good place to start for our discussion would be just to go over the definition of perquisite again from the 2006 release. And let me just briefly read the definition. An item is not a perquisite if it is, quote, integrally and directly related to the performance of the executive's duties. Otherwise, an item is a perquisite if it confers a direct or indirect benefit that has a personal aspect without regard to whether it may be provided for some business reason or for the convenience of the company, unless it's generally available on a non-discriminatory basis to all employees. And I think that's the key issue, is that companies continue to confuse business purpose with perquisite. And they think that if there's a business purpose for the expenditure, even if there's a personal benefit, because it served a company purpose, it doesn't have to be disclosed as a perquisite. And of course, the definition of perquisite, when it comes to the evaluation of a personal benefit, is much more narrow. It is deemed to be perquisite unless it is directly and integrally related to job performance. I think what's interesting about these cases is, first, where did these cases come from? It's not so clear in Dow Chemical. In Argo Group, Argo had a shareholder activist last proxy season that made allegations against the CEO's expenditures. We won that proxy contest when I was with my prior firm. Then the SEC promptly issued a subpoena to that company. All of this is disclosed in the SEC's order, and that sort of resulted in the Argo enforcement action in June. I believe Hilton Hotels was brought by the same team in Philadelphia, and I had heard at the tail end of our investigation for Argo that the same team in Philadelphia had issued a number of requests for information to companies. I'm not sure how they selected that group of companies and whether or not there was some data analytics involved. But in any event, it seems to me that Hilton was sort of caught up in that initial sweep issuing from the Philadelphia regional office. I think what's interesting about these cases is why they continue to happen. Why do companies continue to misapply a definition that has been in place since 14 years ago, 2006? And to my mind, based on my experience in the Argo case, I think that there can be a disconnect in the reimbursement process between the reimbursement process for travel and entertainment expenses and the team that serves the comp committee and runs the CD&A and all the comp tables and the perk tables and the whole HR team that is in charge of compensation. And typically, the travel and entertainment expenses, that reimbursement process is disconnected from the HR process. And I think that's where companies forget or lose track of perks or don't analyze reimbursements as perks. I think another reason why there continues to be these cases is that when business executives mix business and personal together, it's very hard to discern whether or not something is truly business or truly personal unless you really start asking a lot of hard questions. And that can obviously, in the context of an investigation, you get access to facts and emails and so forth. But in real life, when when an executive submits a request for reimbursement, the level of scrutiny that's applied to that request, the process in place for getting approvals by peers to make sure that the requests are bona fide and not basically the executive asking the company to pay for personal expenses, I think that can be a challenging process. And I think it too often depends upon, the executive having the integrity to sort of apply to him or herself, what is or is not the right thing for me to ask reimbursement for. And so I think those are the reasons why, even 14 years after we have the SEC in 2006 redefining the definition of perquisite, why we continue to see these cases, and probably why these cases will from time to time continue to be brought.
The only other thing that I might add to that, and I think all of that is actually completely true, and we see it all the time with our companies, is another additional layer of complexity is that the tax standard for what's considered compensation and what's considered compensation for, it's imputed compensation for tax purposes versus not, is a different standard. The tax standard is closer to, or is actually pretty much like do you have a business purpose, which is exactly what Tom said. That is not sufficient. The SEC standard is narrower, and that disconnect, I think, adds to the difficulty of categorizing whether something is a perk or not.
I think another point to be made is that since 2006, we have not received a lot of guidance from the staff on the application of this definition. So, for example, when you think about a club membership, if it's exclusively used for business, it's not a perk. So what if there is one instance of personal use? Does that make it a perk? And does that mean that the entire, let's say, annual membership cost now needs to be reported as a perk? If you have a city club in which people just have lunch there, that's very easy to categorize, and we can be pretty sure that there won't be personal use of a city club by the CEO's kids. Why would they want to have lunch at a city club where you've got to wear a coat and tie? On the other hand, if the company is paying for a country club membership in which there's like a golf course, and your kid uses it one time, does that not now have to be reported as a perk? And so I think there are a lot of close calls like that in which companies just are, in the absence of guidance, is just not clear. And I do think that that's how people get tripped up in things as basic as country club memberships. That was at issue in Hilton, I believe. No, that was at issue in the Dow case. That was also at issue in the Argo case. And so it's not exactly obvious how to categorize expenses. And I think the other example that we spent a lot of time on and that I think poses difficulty is, as I said, when executives combine business and personal together. Let's say you're supposed to go to Los Angeles for a business trip, and you decide to stay an extra night to see a college friend for dinner. That's an easy case but what if it's the reverse? I want to go to Dallas for a personal reason, but you know what? There's a potential business prospect there and we have coffee. How do you treat that? How do you categorize the expense of taking the executive down to Dallas in my example, which was primarily personal, but he did some business on the side because it was convenient. He had an extra meal, breakfast or coffee. And so could that trip now be characterized as business? And I don't think companies have developed guidelines for those types of mixed use or mixed use of the executive's times. Typically you think that everything is either all business or all personal, but the extent to which executives blend the two together, and then of course when company aircraft is involved and so forth, that's when these questions get tricky. And that's, I think, what you see happening in Hilton, where not that the order gets into it, but I would imagine that there was some combined use of the corporate aircraft or the hotel rooms, and there was probably a combined business plus personal, and the company made a judgment about, well, we think it's business, or and it ended up not, the facts may not have supported all of the facts may not have supported that. But I do think that these questions can get surprisingly subtle because of the way in which people are, working all the time and trying to create a personal life alongside their work life.
Kyoko, are there other circumstances where it's challenging to determine where the scale falls for perks?
I think Tom hit the big ones. Airplanes and other vehicle usage, still continues to be difficult. And I think it really does come from the mixed purpose nature of many kinds of trips. Right now, no one's taking trips, but in normal business times, as Tom noted, it can be difficult to actually find the right line between whether something is business or personal. I think some companies will sort of ask themselves, was the trip primarily business, or was it primarily personal, or was the original sort of purpose of, what was the original intent of the trip? And they sort of take those kinds of factors into account as well. But that then goes to, I think, Tom's earlier point of, you would then have to ask, you would have to inquire quite strictly into these kinds of questions that, typically don't get answered or, asked and answered in the course of sort of everyday business life. And so, and it may not even be a question of integrity or anything like that. It's just, different people have different standards, people have different judgments about these kinds of things, and it can be very difficult. That's one of the reasons why we have said, although this obviously discussion is really around how to analyze perks from an SEC perspective, we have oftentimes, just as a firm, just trying to counsel people in a practical sort of way, have told people, there's obviously the SEC two-part test, and you should look at that test, and that's obviously very important. But ask yourself this, how would, if the item that you're talking about gets splashed across the page, the front pages of the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or some other major newspaper, how would the company feel? How would the individual feel? What kind of reputational aspects are involved at that point? And if you don't want to do that, then just bite the bullet and disclose it as a perk, or don't provide the item at all. But it's one of those things where if that is, that can be a frankly much more sort of easy to implement standard than this very highly nuanced standard of, whether something is integrally and directly related to the performance of the person's responsibilities. I think another area where things can be very difficult is technology and the related services relating to technology. And, I think it's very interesting, like when you go back to the adopting release in 2006, the SEC acknowledges that Blackberries and laptops may be, things that are meant to, facilitate the executive's ability to perform his or her duties, actually. And, you really date yourself when you think about what was, even a question back in the day, because it talks about, well, if the executive needs to be able to regularly access their emails, as if that were a question. Obviously nowadays we live in very different times, 14 years later, and even then, one might have said that we lived in different times. I think that the SEC, clearly acknowledges that they literally say in the adopting release, quote, new technology facilitates the extent to which work is conducted outside the office. And so they very presciently predicted that time, that this would advance. And, cut to 2020, and we have the coronavirus pandemic going on right now. The SEC came out with a CD&I that acknowledged that certain kinds of enhanced technology could be used to improve the executive's home workspace when stay-at-home orders are in place. But then that begs the question of, okay, fine, now we are in these very unique and surreal circumstances, but what if stay-at-home orders are lifted, which they are in fact in many parts around the country? What if they're lifted, but the company has evolved to move towards a much more remote work environment? In fact, they're encouraging people to not work from, to work from a remote work environment. Maybe the company is even, reducing its real estate footprint. There are many reasons for why, this is we're moving into a different kind of business life workspace and work mix altogether. And in that context, would it make sense to treat more and more different kinds of technologies that allow you to do that as perks? I think the SEC's original principles around this would suggest yes, but it definitely, you have to ask yourself the question, and every introduction of a new technology causes companies to wonder, is this a perk, in this context? I think there's also questions of, at some point, are certain kinds of items just too exclusive or viewed to be too luxurious? If you provide certain kinds of technology or transportation usage for some, but not to others, is the fact that differential exists, does that make that more, something more of a perk or not? Where do you sort of see the line where something ceases to be quote unquote directly and integrally related to the executive's performance of their duties? So I think that that analysis continues to be very difficult, and I think it'll continue to be difficult, even though we've had many years to think about the original two-part test.
Kyoko, on your last point, it reminds me of one of the more difficult judgments we had to make in Argo, and that was the company had paid for the CEO to attend the Metropolitan Museum of Art's annual Costume Institute annual gala. This is like some super fancy party, a lot of fashion people go, but I didn't know this, but regular people, I mean, if they are connected enough, they can get invitations to go, and they actually have to pay like $35,000 per person to go. And this is actually a 401k. It is a charitable institution, so like the company could get a charitable donation for that. And we looked at this situation very carefully, and we said, what distinguishes this from like the ordinary rubber chicken dinner that the company buys a table and you begrudgingly give up a Tuesday night and you go to it and nobody's happy about it, but you show the flag and you support the local institution, and nobody would ever think that that's a perk. One might even say it's a hardship. And yet, why would we characterize the going to the Costume Institute annual gala as a perk? And, I think in that instance, notwithstanding the fact that there's a lot of networking opportunities and so on, and in that particular instance, the company did not pay for a table. Its logo was not splashed on any materials. It had just paid for the CEO and his wife to attend. The conclusion was something not too far from what you talked about, that it was just such a super luxurious, fabulous event that the idea that the company should be paying for that, and that's not a personal benefit, and somehow that was directly and integrally related to job performance. But I do think that I have gotten calls from clients that read the Hilton case, they want to learn more about it, they read the Argo case, and they're like, why was that judgment made? And because it's obviously now we're sort of far afield from the definition of perquisite, we're trying to apply to fact patterns that are very particular, but there is that sort of aspect of, well, how do I distinguish this payment from the rubber chicken, annual benefit in my local town that, we need to show up for? And I do think that does require a lot of judgment to apply to the fact pattern, and oftentimes, too often, that doesn't happen. You don't engage a securities lawyer to help you think through the way in which you do or do not need to disclose this as a benefit, because too often you think it's just like the chicken dinner from the local nonprofit that we support every year. And so I do think that one takeaway from these cases should be, what level of controls do we have, and what level of judgment is being applied to a lot of these sort of one-off types of expenses that are submitted through the travel entertainment channel, in which our securities lawyers, our disclosure lawyers are not typically involved in evaluating those expenses. And so, certainly one takeaway for me in terms of how do companies respond positively and proactively to these cases, one of the takeaways is to evaluate the controls around not only travel and entertainment expense, but also the policy itself and the training around who approves those expenses, and do those people understand the difference, and do they know to ask counsel or to pose the question to the in-house people who are in charge of the compensation program and compensation disclosures. Do they know enough to sort of direct those inquiries, go to those people to ask the necessary and appropriate questions?
You might not realize that the PERK definition from the SEC is actually in this adopting release that when they did a reform for the proxy disclosures regarding executive pay in 2006. So it's not in an actual rule or an actual regulation. It's sort of hidden away. And I have a separate Vid-Guide parsing that definition thoroughly. And the other thing is I taped 30 different Vid-Guides about particular types of perks that are common. And there is a little bit of a lore to some of these types of perks, and that the analysis is not necessarily seemingly consistent on its face among all of them. And so it's important to check with your peers within your law firm if you're in a firm, or even cross law firms, because when I sort of talked to a bunch of people before I made those Vid-Guides, there was this, in some perk areas, there's sort of a wide breadth of interpretation about how conservative or liberal you can be about a particular definition. So it was pretty interesting and scary to do that. So Kyoko, what types of disclosure controls, I guess since the 2018 enforcement action against Dow Chemical, companies began becoming more serious about, for certain types of perks, about documenting what was going on. What should companies be doing with their disclosure controls in the wake of these new cases, or maybe that didn't move the needle at all?
So I think for starters, many companies have had processes and protocols to really capture the myriad of items that might be considered a perk, but they are being more formal about it, and also at the same time making sure that they are also being capturing informal things too, because so much of what this is, this is an area that particularly lends itself to, it's really the informality of actions that sometimes gets companies into trouble. So there's really two aspects. On the formal side, companies have had questionnaires where they've asked executives and also their directors all sorts of questions. We are seeing more and more companies include very detailed, ever lengthening lists of potential perks based on all the cases that are coming out, and they will ask their CEOs to or their other executives to literally go through the laundry list of items. And sometimes these are items that you chuckle over and you say these even if they're perks at someplace else, they'd never be perks here because it's just not part of the corporate culture. But you definitely have people will pause over some of these difficult items that we were talking about before. Technology, transportation, things like even use of additional company personnel for potentially personal purposes and things along those lines, actually. So that I think is very helpful. And by making by asking your executive officers and directors to really affirmatively review the list and make sure and also point out new items that have been added to the list from the prior year, I think that can be one thing that at least causes executives to at least take stock and sort of think about what might have happened during the course of the year. Clearly on the flip side, informally, I think legal departments, corporate secretaries' offices, the people who deal with, as Tom noted before, the proxy statement, for example, especially given the narrow definition of, or given the broad definition of what is a perk versus the narrow definition of what is not a perk, companies are having those individuals and more of those control functions be more, well plugged in with everyone, ranging from executive admins to, people in procurement, corporate security, company food services, company travel services, all those groups that executives touch where these kinds of questions might, are most likely to come up. And companies are spending more time training those individuals and really, explaining to them with real life examples so that people, so that those people can help be on the front line of understanding what might or might not be a perk, or at least to ask the question, and oftentimes they have the best relationship in that context to ask the relevant executive, what are you doing this for? Who are you going to go see? what else are you doing? And, that can be in a more informal banter-like context that can actually give rise to really, really relevant information that it might be difficult for, the lawyers to ask. And that way that can bubble up and hopefully be part of the analysis. And again, I think as a disclosure lawyer, trying to rely on informality like that is somewhat, frankly, frightening. But if you ask yourself, where does this information reside? Sometimes, just making sure that people are properly trained in those areas and understand why why these questions are relevant can be particularly helpful. And then obviously to, document and have, logs of whether it's travel or accommodations or whatever the thing is, to make sure that there was at least a thought process that was applied, and to decide whether something was a perk or whether something was not a perk, or maybe some portion is allocable for to not be a perk, but maybe a portion is, and to just make sure that you go through that process. That oftentimes requires people who are in the corporate secretary's office to pore over detailed logs, travel logs, accommodation logs, things like that. But it's just, it just has to be done in order to prevent the kinds of foot faults that have gotten other companies in trouble over the years.
I just want to reinforce what Kyoko said about the training of administrative assistants. They're the ones who are closest to their boss, are very involved in his work life and maybe even personal life. And they're really the ones who are best situated. And first of all, they're the ones who fill out the request for reimbursement. So they need to be trained on what is and is not the right thing to ask for. They're the ones who know why the boss is going where he or she is going. And so I think training at that level, I think, would be very effective. Also, the other point that you make, Kyoko, that I want to absolutely underscore is the importance of the D&O questionnaire. How many times have we seen a questionnaire that does pose these questions and then the executive says, ask my admin? I don't think that is an appropriate resolution of that question, because you want your CEO, you want your executive officer to be making a representation to the company about the perks that he or she knows he or she used. Maybe nobody else knows except for that person. And for that reason, from an employment law standpoint, you need the executive officer to make that representation to you about the perks that he or she is aware of. And so if an executive officer simply fills it out and says, ask my admin, I think you should go back and say, no, you need to fill this out. I need a representation from you that you've either circled all of the perks that you've used or that there aren't any. And you need to make that representation. You need to fill this out and take this process seriously, because so much really does depend on it. And because if the company later has just a disclosure miss, at least with respect to its own options and thinking about how it can deal with this executive officer who has maybe significant amounts of unreported perks. From an employment law standpoint, it just gives you that many more options than if he or she, the executive, just left that unfilled out. And so just thinking ahead to sort of situations in which you might need to use that questionnaire in contexts other than filling out proxy statements, just think about the way in which the importance of getting the executive on record as to what perks he or she did not use or did use.
Yeah, and in addition to training, anytime there is a perks enforcement investigation that comes to fruition, that's a good time to happen to drop by their desk or email it to them that, hey, the SEC brought this perks investigation, let them know this is a real thing. And that by, reinforcing the training, so it's not you train them once and then 5 years, for 5 years, you don't really reinforce that message.
Right. And the incentive to get this right is that, CEOs and executive officers, this is the sort of thing that can get them terminated, is misconduct in connection with very small amounts relatively to their overall pay, but misconduct or just lack of compliance and lack of attention on important matters like use of corporate aircraft. That is always going to be on the staff's list. They know that it's a wonderful, shiny thing to be able to use, and they know executives want to use it for personal use. And so, I think that was I think in common in all three of the recent actions was personal use of corporate aircraft that went unreported.
So Tom, what about the actual process when the SEC's enforcement division does get involved? What are the steps that the company should initially take?
Well, obviously, cooperation, I think, obviously is critically important, and cooperation. But then, in addition to that, thinking about, well, we need to conduct a review in response to the request for information or the subpoena, and how do we do that? And in the Argo case, we engaged, or my law firm engaged, KPMG Forensic to actually evaluate the company's books and records and all of the all the financial records. And I do think that one way of dealing with an SEC request for information is, obviously you have to start examining internally the controls around the use of corporate aircraft, if in fact you have corporate aircraft, the controls around travel and entertainment expenses, and you really need to get a handle very quickly on your expenditures. And so I think cooperation plus thinking about, do we need to engage outside law firm? Because again, if I'm looking into the CEO's expenses, the CFOs, it's very difficult for an in-house legal team to do that, given the fact that they are reporting to the CEO. And so I think, number one, engaging outside counsel. Number two, making clear that the outside counsel is reporting to some independent board committee. It cannot be run by management because it's management's expenditures that are at issue in the review. And then third, does the law firm have the skill set necessary, and do they need to supplement with a forensic audit firm to make sure that they are in fact looking at everything carefully and that their findings will be accepted as credible and as reasonable by the staff. And so I think those are three things that we need to put in place very quickly: is the engagement of outside law firm, a reporting structure to an independent board committee, and the evaluation of whether or not, can internal audit do this, or given the sensitive nature of the request for information, which is the CEO's perks, or all of the NEO's perks, do we need to engage an outside audit firm, and doing that quickly so that when you can report out to the SEC staff that you will be responding to their request for information by X date, you can make clear to them that you've already put in place an investigative process that they should feel comfortable is credible and thorough and objective, and will not be in conflict with management's interests.
So thanks so much, Tom and Kyoko. Tom, congratulations on your new gig. Always exciting. Good way to
Thanks.
start the new year. That's awesome.
Thanks.
Thank you, Kyoko.
Nice seeing you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.